I'd like to welcome everybody to this next presentation in the series of Community of Practice webinars. The Risk Informed Performance Based Principles and Policy Committee, RP3C, of ANS has been putting on these events for the past 5 years. Presentations and recordings of the events are available to the public at the ANS website under the tab RP3C. There are now almost 50 such recordings available. The purpose of these webinars is to offer practitioners of concepts and methods related to risk-informed and performance-based approaches, we call them RIPB, a chance to share their knowledge and experience. I would expect that such practice is used for implementing nuclear technology and evaluating its safety and effectiveness. The purpose of RP3C is to help modernize ANS standards. The Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act, NEMA of 2019, associated modernization with application of RIPB approaches. Congress reiterated and reinforced the idea of using RIPB to achieve effective regulation and oversight of nuclear technology in 2024 with the ADVANCE Act. There is growing realization within the nuclear community that conventional, prescriptive, and deterministic approaches are not going to support increasing use of nuclear technology to play its rightful role for the benefit of society. Socializing alternative approaches could drive changes in industry and regulatory practices. ANS offers the COP files on its website to serve as a knowledge repository of the experience from a wide range of practitioners in the field. We hope that more people will use this knowledge base to speed up needed changes in the state of the art as well as the state of practice. These events are generally scheduled for the last Friday of a month. Today, we will hear from Megan Harkema of Vanderbilt University. She will introduce herself and the topic that she will speak on. So, Megan, please take it away.
All right. Thank you so very much, Prasad, Pat, Brandon, Steve, and the entire RP3C committee for having me today. As Prasad mentioned, my name is Megan Harkema. I am a research engineer at Vanderbilt University, and I have been asked to speak to you today on the topic of risk informing. And specifically, when we say we're going to risk inform a design, what does that mean at the beginning? So when, where, and how do we start the process of risk informing? Before I get into any more detail there, I just want to plug for a second the Nuclear Environmental Engineering Research Group at Vanderbilt. We have been operating at Vandy since 2010, performing research for a host of clients, including EPRI, DOE, NE, and a good amount of commercial advanced reactor customers. We work in a variety of intellectual areas, but the one I want to spend time focusing on today is the work we have done to integrate risk and safety analysis into early stages of design for advanced nuclear reactors. And this started in the 2014 to 2015 time frame with a project we worked on with EPRI titled the Safety and Design Project. Now, we completed our final report, our capstone report on that in the 2019 timeframe. But since that time, we have gone about implementing safety and design for a number of advanced reactor customers with a few different concepts in mind there as well. So for those of you unfamiliar, I do want to give a bit of a primer on safety and design. I will not go into the motivation since Prasad did a great job of describing why we need risk-informed, performance-based approaches in this day and age. But I will talk about safety and design, which was developed to help meet this need by integrating early and iterative safety analysis processes into the design process for two reasons. First, to help build your safety case, and secondly, to help avoid costly, from both financial and time perspectives, sort of retrofitting of a design to meet any sort of safety requirements identified. And the tools that we use to sort of implement the safety and design methodology or the safety and design framework are called process hazards analysis, or PHA methods. And on the right-hand side here, you see our safety and design framework, which we like to call the boxology internally. And if you really want to know the reason I'm giving this presentation today, it has to do with the fact that there is no start here, circle, square indication on this diagram, and that is truly intentional. What we've seen, and we would highlight over and over again, is that the way you move through the safety and design framework is dependent on design and environment specific factors. But that doesn't mean we can't have this general framework in mind as we're working through it. So the way you read this diagram is we start at the bottom left with collecting data, performing simple process hazards analyses methodologies, and incrementally work toward developing a quantitative safety case, in this case, the gold standard being a probabilistic risk assessment for a design. But again, that begs the question of when, where, and how do we start? Particularly for non-LWRs. I do also have some related references here. I know this is going on YouTube, so feel free to review this, pause the screen, and then look at those references on safety and design if you are interested. So let's dive into the first question, which is, when do we start? And our research has shown that there truly are benefits to starting as early as possible. But when we're starting early, we need to be thoughtful in our approach. So again, process hazards analysis methodologies are the tools that we use here to perform the SID method overall. And they were developed for use predominantly in the chemical process industry as well as the aerospace industry for systems that may not require a full probabilistic risk assessment. So truly, they were designed to be flexible and evaluate hazards and evaluate risk in sort of different ways than we traditionally think about it for the nuclear industry. However, all PHA methods are not created equally. We need to be thoughtful when we choose our PHA, particularly for analysis of a high hazard system at early phases of design, excuse me. So in terms of the considerations that go into selecting PHAs, I've lumped them into two categories. The first being some of the logistical questions. What are our objectives? How many resources do we have available? You know, is this you sitting in your cubicle performing the evaluation, or do you have a team of design, operations, safety analysts willing to collaborate and sit in a room and take as long as it takes to do this type of evaluation? How do you have the appropriate documentation? Do you have the appropriate computer software to perform these evaluations? And all of that stuff really does end up impacting your selection. What I will be talking about in detail during this presentation is sort of the second category of considerations, which have to do with design maturity. And depending on the design maturity in question, there's different breadths of hazards that you can consider. There's a difference in terms of your ability to gain qualitative versus quantitative results and insights. You know, at an early stage of design, it's probably best to identify single failures before you move into identifying multiple or common cause failures. And so really what this gets us to is that the PHA approach that we select depends on the amount and nature of design and hazard information that we have available to us. But also, let's not forget that this is intended to be an iterative process. So if you don't solve all of your objectives in one go around of implementing a PHA, that doesn't mean you can't consider them at a later stage of design. Which is really this spiral diagram on the right-hand side is taken from systems engineering, which allows you to sort of see how a design progresses from pre-conceptual to conceptual to final designs and as-builts we've taken that and adapted it to consider how we can integrate safety analysis as part of this process. So at early stages of designs, you can perform things like a what if or a what if checklist analysis and get quantitative or qualitative understandings of your frequencies and consequences. And as you mature, you can begin to use more and more rigorous tools to evaluate your system. But that doesn't mean that even when you're integrating a simple process hazards analysis method into your safety analysis and design process, that you don't need to have supporting information available. The easiest example I can give here is that if you want to perform a what if checklist analysis, well, you need an appropriate checklist analysis to do that. And let's be realistic here, those may or may not actually exist in this day and age for advanced reactors. So that gets us to our second question, which is where do we get the data that we need to build a knowledge base to support the performance of a process hazards analysis methodology? And my overall question, if you take nothing else home, is to do your homework here. And so a lot of comments we get are that, well, why are we doing safety analysis before we have the design specific data to do that safety analysis? And the answer really is, well, there is data out there. You just may need to get creative in how you're using it and how you're collecting it and how you're analyzing it to gain insights for the system that you're responsible for designing. We've sort of categorized data that can feed into the safety and design process into three different regions. The first being operating experience data. This can be further broken down into what we like to call historical operating experience or generally sort of modern operating experience. Secondly, there's stylized accidents. So this is what we see a lot in the literature today. For example, a Melcor analysis of a LOCA covered in a journal article or a conference paper and things like that. And then finally, there's also relevant phenomenological data out there that can help us to get a preliminary understanding of what phenomena might be of interest for our design. Now I'll go into talking about these data categories in a bit more detail. The first one being historical operating experience. Now, I would imagine most of us on this call are fairly familiar with the historical operating data that is out there from technically similar reactors tested at the Department of Energy and National Laboratory Complex between the 1950s and the 1970s. And so what we've really seen in our research is that this reactor and test facility data and the documentation of this data can really be the most thorough manufacturing, construction, operational, and retirement experience out there for a given concept. But that does not mean that all historical data is created equally or that we're going to easily be able to access that data. And so I want to spend a minute here going over, how do exactly can we get access to this historical data? And I have these ranked from easiest to do to probably most complicated to do. So we've had a lot of luck using web-based keyword searches, particularly at OSTI, but as well as Google Scholar for getting information about systems like the molten salt reactor experiment. But for some other systems, we've had to, like I said, get a little more creative, going to component reliability databases. Some of those have been specifically built for advanced reactors, like the Sodium System Component Reliability Database, NASCORD, or the equivalent for molten salt reactors being Mozart. But we've also used generic databases like the Savannah River National Laboratory database. Now, developers have a few other options directly available to them. One is to leverage the Game Legacy Document Project, which can connect developers with the people in the laboratory complex who can review sort of records that may not be publicly available from OSTI or internal laboratory databases, review that for expert control classification, and then get that to the appropriate developers for their reuse. Now, we've also seen developers cut out the middleman and directly execute CRADAs with national laboratories to get access to some of this information. But as I mentioned before, we do need to be careful using historical data, particularly if we're using it for our safety case. And so when we're using it in this way, we need to understand that what we're presenting in terms of our design and the performance of our design will ultimately be sent to a regulator for their perspectives and review. And so we've identified a few factors that while we're designing a system, we should be keeping in mind when we're using historical data. And these can range from things like how did you access the data? Is it publicly available? Was this system a one-off or was it well tested? And one of the most important ones for the safety analysis process is what is your understanding of the quality control and quality assurance processes used in collecting that data historically, or generally, was that quality assurance, quality control process documented? And there are ways to sort of retrofit QA/QC onto the data that we've seen developed out of, I believe, Idaho National Laboratory, and we can get you that reference if you'd like. There's also obviously modern operating experience, and this fits into sort of two categories as well. One being data from a test facility specific to the design that you are responsible for developing. So something that another one of your team members may be working on. The other category we have here is operating experience from other component or reliability databases like TH test loops, integrated effects test facilities, critical experiments that may be out there that could be used as input to your knowledge base, with some examples given on the right-hand side here. But again, there's caveats here, and let's start with the easy one, which is that if you're taking data from a quote unquote technically similar system, similar does not mean the same. You do need to screen that data for relevancy to your design. We have done that previously using expert judgment as well as delta analysis if a more systematic framework is needed there. The other caveat I will make as well, and this is something near and dear to my heart, is that if you're using data or you want to use data specific to your design that someone has been collecting, well, you need to actually go and collect and retain that data. And so there's a need for sort of intra-organizational collaboration and communication to make sure that the people developing a facility and actually running the facility are collecting data that you can use to support your safety case development and design development processes. The next category we have of data is stylized accident studies. And now I think all of us are probably pretty well aware that there's so much stylized accident information out there in the literature for light water reactors, for a variety of advanced reactor concepts. And so what we've previously done with this data is use it in sort of an aggregate form. So although it's not a substitute for comprehensive initiating event identification, going forward and collecting all of this information in a comprehensive way can help us get an understanding of the undesirable events and how they propagate within our system, which can ultimately be used as part of the rationale presented to a regulator for the comprehensiveness of your initiating event identification processes. The thing I really want to drive home here is that this is not a trivial process just because of the wealth of information out there. And so I want to spend some time talking about the graphs that you see on this slide. So we performed safety analysis for the General Atomics Fast Modular Reactor ARC-20 project, in which we did a potential initiating event identification literature review. So we identified 106 different references with gas-cooled reactor-related potential initiating events in that. Then we had to go through each of those references, pull out the potential initiating events, screen them for uniqueness, which we did, and we ended up with 550 total PIEs to consider. We then had to categorize that according to a scheme that looks very similar to the NRC's initiating event categorization screen. And then we had to go through and categorize those for relevancy to the design that we were working with. So this was overall a very beneficial process. It helped us to streamline our safety analysis in the future and to determine which systems hadn't been evaluated very well in the literature to date. But it is a pretty resource-intensive process. The last category of data I'll discuss is sort of phenomenological data, and I will also plug Brandon and Steve here for just a moment. um, Being that they have previously put out information on the importance of considering phenomena specific to advanced reactors. And one of the good examples you can give here is the potential for flow reversal in actively cooled decay heat removal systems. I mean, obviously, this can be considered in AP1000s as well. But this is something that may not necessarily have been considered for light water reactors traditionally. What we've seen in implementing the safety and design process is that PHAs are great for organizing phenomenological data into event and accident sequences. But in and of themselves, they're not necessarily designed or well suited to identifying phenomena from the get-go. So this is where we pull in tools like phenomena identification and ranking tables to help us just consider low-level phenomena here. But again, at an early stage of design, we're not saying that you have all of the data you need to actually go out and perform a PERT. There have, however, been a wealth of PERTs performed in recent years for almost every advanced reactor concept being considered, and those may be generally applicable for adoption at early stages in the process. All right, last question, and hopefully the most interesting of all of this, which is we have all of this data. Now, what in the world do we do with it? How do we use it to risk inform? Now, in a perfect world, I would have time to discuss in detail two different case studies that show you just how different this process can look based on your objectives and environmental context that you're working within. However, this is a 40-minute presentation, not an 80-minute presentation on this beautiful Friday afternoon, so I will go into detail on one of these. But before I do so, I do just want to mention the work again that we did as part of the General Atomics FMR project. So in that case, we were evaluating an entire reactor. Our goal was to develop an initial safety case for the reactor as a whole, and we were working within a historical context that was a bit different than on the other side, which is that no gas fast reactors have been operated. But obviously, there's a moderate wealth of experience out there for gas-cooled concepts generally, and also the passive decay heat removal systems being studied for gas-fast reactors have also been considered for advanced light water reactors. And the resources we had available were two analysts, i.e. grad students, one of which was me at the time. And we were able to dedicate about 7 to 8 months part-time to each of the PHA evolutions that we performed, with a host of reviewers available to help us there as well. The case study I'm actually going to focus on was my dissertation research, which was the development of a molten salt sampling system, or MSSS, for use within molten salt reactors generally. And so this project was funded by the NEOP program with the overall goal of developing and demonstrating a molten salt sampling system that outperforms its historical predecessor. So instead of a whole reactor, we're looking at developing a subsystem. We have a bit different historical context. There were approximately two molten salt reactors, depending on who you talk to, that have previously been operated. And there was one previous iteration of the MSSS that we identified, and we found detailed operating and maintenance records, which informed our process. And so in that case, we had one analyst with performing about 2 to 3 months part-time per PHA evolution that we looked at. We performed three sort of iterations of the safety analysis process as part of MSSS development. The first was a stamp-based analysis of the historically similar system. Then we moved on to a failure modes and effects analysis of our conceptual design. And then finally, we're able to develop what we like to call a semi-quantitative fault tree for our as-built prototype. But before I go into that, it's obviously the focus of this presentation is on the safety analysis process. But if you're anything like me, trying to move forward without understanding what in the world is an MSSS and why do we need one, it would be difficult. So I'll spend a few minutes just talking about what exactly is a molten salt sampling system. So molten salt reactors are molten salt fueled or molten salt cooled reactors. And the benefits that they provide from those perspectives include higher heat removal or higher temperatures that allow for increases in efficiency and different deployment flexibilities, as well as potential safety and safeguards improvements. But molten salt reactors are sensitive to a few different chemical and isotopic considerations, predominantly given the liquid form of the fuel in question. And so then it becomes important for us to understand, predict, and control those characteristics. And particularly within first generation molten salt reactors, experts perceive that this will require periodically removing small grab samples of salt, testing them for things like fissile and fertile consumption and production rates, fission product concentrations, contaminant concentrations, redox conditions to make sure that your system is within its operational envelope. So the MSRE, which operated at Oak Ridge between 1965 to 1969, used a system called the sampler enricher to do this. But as I'll get into in a bit here, that system's reliability, as documented in the MSR program's semi-annual progress reports, was insufficient for us to directly incorporate that design into modern MSRs, motivating the NIA project that we got to work on this. But that doesn't mean that we can't learn from the historical system and how it operated to inform our design and not make the same mistakes that occurred in the past. So we did this using a systematic causal analysis of failure and maintenance data, and the tool we used was a fit-for-purpose variant of the system's theoretic accident model and process, or STAMP. Now, STAMP was developed in around the 2010 timeframe by Dr. Nancy Levinson at MIT to account for the complex accident contributors that we see in sort of these large socio-technical systems that are being developed today. And so these include things like system and operator feedback mechanisms, flaws in the control process, and hierarchical communication flaws. When I was referring to previously the sampler enricher's performance, I think it's useful to spend a bit of time saying what exactly do we mean by the system was insufficiently reliable. So within those MSR program semi-annual reports, we were able to tally up 744 total sampling evolutions that had been performed over 4 years, with the bulk of those being removing small amounts of fuel salt for this laboratory testing. Some of those evolutions were to actually add fresh fuel to maintain reactivity within the system. So this system operated, I guess I would say in my own personal opinion, quite poorly. So much so that the MSR program directors commissioned a report purely on the sampler enricher's performance at the end of the MSRE's operational period. However, the project management description is a little more optimistic than my own, saying, quote, the system required some minor repairs. However, when we looked at this in detail, we were able to identify 64 different occurrences for this very small subsystem in I guess, small reactor, which equates to more than one occurrence per month for the system, twice requiring the shutdown of the reactor to resolve. And in response to that, there were performed approximately 140 individual corrective actions. But alas, all of these were not successful. And here on the right-hand side is an example excerpt from one of the MSR program reports. I don't have time to read it to you, unfortunately, but in terms of what I meant when I said unsuccessful, you'll see highlighted in the darker yellow here that 76 different attempts were made of the same action at one point to basically regain control of the sample collection capsules themselves. And the other thing I want to point out is that this is the form of the information that we were working with in this process or project. You know, we didn't have a detailed discretized list of 64 different occurrences. We had to go through information like this and pull those out. And I do want to bring this back to the risk-informed performance-based sort of standards guidance document that ANS did put out. And they listed a number of attributes for a risk-informed process. And one of those is the use of thresholds or criteria to examine system performance. We received a qualitative requirement for this criteria from DOE-NE when we got the project, which was achieving a higher degree of reliability than this historical system. But we were able to use the evaluation methodology that we did to turn that into a quantitative insight here. So this slide both describes in some ways the stamp-based process that we used, as well as shows how we pulled design insights from that process. So like I said previously, we started by discretizing individual occurrences, identifying the corrective actions that were performed in response to each occurrence. Then we pulled in the stamp-based process to identify the relevant hazards associated with the occurrence. And STAMP considers safety to be lost when a safety constraint is violated. And so we identified the safety constraints that were violated for our system as well. And you will notice that these safety constraints look very similar to functional requirements, and that is intentional with the STAMP process itself. We then went on a bit of, and this is where we get into the fit for purpose element of this process to look at what insights we could gain actually from the corrective actions that were performed. So that included characterizing corrective actions as being effective with a whole host of explicit criteria that meant. It could mean returning the system to its normal operating state or putting the system into a safe shutdown state until further maintenance could be performed, as well as a host of other criteria. We also categorized these corrective actions as being design, procedure changes, mitigative measures, repairs or replacements, or diagnostic evolutions. And that led us to be able to analyze those frequently credited repair and replacement and design change evolutions for further design insights, which is what you see in this breakdown of repeated instances of repair and replacement here. Now, to save time, I'm not going to go into details here, but just know that the insights we were able to gain from here allowed us to pull in failure modes into the later stage failure modes and effects analysis that we performed on our conceptual design, as well as gave us some insights into how we could design effective mitigation and recovery mechanisms for our system. So summarizing the MSRE sampler enricher hazards we identified from this stamp-based process, we end up with this table here. And some of these hazards are pretty standard, but the one I want to focus on is highlighted, which is the inability to sample or enrich fuel salt. And this evaluation really showed us just how important that was from a safety perspective, because if we can't sample or enrich our fuel salt, we can produce a reduced understanding of the makeup of the salt, which could lead to reactor shutdown over a long term, or the integration of an unsafe control action if we were to misunderstand the makeup of our fuel salt itself. So we pulled this into, using the attributes of a risk-informed process again into our endpoint for our later stage evaluation, which was to choose failure to obtain a sample as the top level event in our fault tree analysis that we performed on our as-built prototype. Moving into just very briefly the sort of middle ground that we did, which was the failure modes and effects analysis of the conceptual design. Here's an example of some of the results we got from this evaluation. We identified over 331 total failures for what realistically is a pretty small system within a molten salt reactor generally. But from a risk informing perspective, I want to focus on a few different things here, which is the use of these other columns in your failure modes and effects analysis to gain insights. The first being, again, an aggregate examination of detection and mitigation or recovery mechanisms, which we've seen. If you look at where you have frequently credited detection and mitigation and recovery mechanisms, that can both tell you, okay, where do I need my detection mechanisms to have a high degree of reliability? And two, where do I maybe need to diversify the mechanisms that I'm using there? So one of those that's easy to discuss in this context is if your detection mechanism is no sample obtained, which it was 10 times for us. That means you're getting all the way through the sampling process before you realize a failure occurred in your system. So we were able to go back and make design changes to allow us to differentiate between failures that could lead to no sample being obtained. The other place where we can gain good insights from a PHA are the resolution of action items. And we identified 58 of them on our conceptual design here. And these can range from things like develop procedures or better define the operational envelope to go perform a multi-physics evaluation of your system to better characterize its performance before you move on to testing. So I'm almost done now, I promise. The testing approach that we used was multi-phased and allowed us to increase in sort of relevant hazards being realized. So on the left is our conceptual design that we were able to translate into a few different prototypes. And again, the thing I want to focus on here is how we used our testing to help us better understand the failure modes that could happen for the system and how that could lead to the overall top event of failure to obtain a sample. And so we had these different branches that you see on the bottom that we were able to decompose most of. But the one that I'm going to focus on in a bit more detail is the freeze port branch that we developed and tested. So a freeze port is very similar to the freeze valves being considered for use within molten salt reactors, in that it is an alternative to a traditional electromechanical valve where you have a frozen section of salt acting as the closed valve, and then you can use sort of heaters to heat that and melt it when you need to open the valve. The reason we call this a port instead of a valve is because in addition to the fluid flowing through this when we need it to, we're also passing our sampling equipment through it so it can access the bulk salt underneath to get a representative sample for our evaluation. So we were able to create the freeze port test bed you see on the right-hand side here at the University of Michigan's Molten Salt Facility for Instrumentation Tests, or MISFIT, which for any of you who have worked with molten salts know is a very appropriate name for this facility. And so this test bed allowed us to test a few different important areas for our freeze port. The first being, can we pneumatically control the level of salt in the port when the port is in the open position? And then two, can we use the sort of the thermocouples we have placed at different spots here to determine when the port has been frozen? And so this was a whole process that occurred in, I believe, January of 2023. And we were able to test the system 2 times. Now, I will be completely candid here. Our goal was originally to test on the order of 10 to 20 times, but this was a COVID impacted project, so we had to work with what we could here. But the thing I want to drive home here from the risk-informed perspective is our testing evolution allowed us to identify additional failure modes and allowed us to start collecting some reliability related information that we can bring forward. And so we did this by creating, again, a semi-quantitative fault tree where we went through and just tallied the failures we had. You know, we had 2 overall sampling evolutions. We're not going to go through a full quantitative evaluation here. But the thing that's helpful is we were able to sort of color code this fault tree to say, okay, could this failure event have occurred during testing, but it didn't? Could this failure event not have occurred during testing? And were failure events actually accrued during testing? And so this allowed us to start expanding this process in a way that will build toward a later stage safety case. And again, just bringing this back to the overall risk-informed performance-based attributes, in going back to the risk metric development here, you know, one of the goals for a risk-informed process is the use of risk metrics to determine the success of your system or the acceptability of your system. And so obviously we're at a pretty low level of testing here. We're not going to develop a risk metric in detail, but we did collect some failure rate data that provides a starting point for building from the ground up toward that eventual risk metric development. Okay, and checking time, just to conclude very quickly with some overall observations for implementing safety and design. When to start. As early as preconceptual design, we can start compiling information and performing early stage process hazards evaluations. And at this point, in these early stages, our information does not necessarily need to come from design specific sources, but we can use relevant data from technical parallels to assist us. In terms of where to start, obviously building a knowledge base that will help us both in design and safety analysis perspectives is important. And this data can come from operating experience, stylized accidents that are documented in the literature, and relevant phenomena data, whether we're identifying that ourselves or relying on phenomena that have been identified for similar systems. And as we mature our design, we can go forward and build in operations and maintenance data collection into our test and demonstration programs that we can continue to use developing our safety case. And finally, how to start. We do need to tailor our approach to the data availability and our objectives. But regardless, we can start again with generally applicable data, working with high level hazards, and moving into more rigorous processes and starting to use design specific data as our design matures. So the last thing I would like to do is just thank all of the people who made this talk and all of the work described within it possible, including the Electric Power Research Institute, particularly Dr. Andrew Souter and Eric Thornsberry. And I'd also like to especially shout out Adam Barak and Dr. Xiaodong Sung from the University of Michigan, who were instrumental in our molten salt testing. And with that, I will hand it back over to the organizers.
Yeah, Megan. So I've got one question here from the chat, and this goes back to some of the content that you had on like slides 18 to 20. So Greg Hudson is interested in if Nancy Levison or John Thomas were involved with your stamp analysis of the molten salt sampling system. And then he also asks if you have any feedback. I think that was specifically related to the involvement of Nancy or John, but I mean, I think that in general, any feedback on the stamp analysis, even if they weren't, would probably be relevant.
Yeah, that's a easy question to answer. So we did reach out to Nancy and John to see if they would be interested. Unfortunately, we weren't able to hear back from them, and we were on a timeline where we couldn't wait too long in the process. We have sort of conveyed and publicized the stamp analysis within the nuclear community, trying to sort of gain some traction for it, knowing it's not traditionally used in nuclear, or at least outside of Nancy and John Thomas's work, not traditionally used in the nuclear environment. And people were pretty receptive, but we haven't seen much further integration of it in the literature since that time.
I would also add that the process is documented. There's a fairly substantial discussion of how to do that type of analysis in one of Nancy's books.
Hey, Megan, this is Prasad. The molten salt sampling system, after you get a sample, how long does it take to get an assay that is, meaningful for reactor control?
So that is a great question and was something we scoped out of our project. I can provide you a bit of background information that might be useful on that front to hopefully help you. So the way this was done at the MSRE sampler enricher is that you pulled out a sample, brought it into something on the order, and these were 10 to 20 gram samples. They weren't large, but you brought it into about 1,000 pounds of lead and concrete shielding, stuck that apparatus on the back of a truck, and drove it across the ORNL campus to Building 2026, which was the radioisotope laboratory for testing. Not sure how long that took. But there are talks, and something we've considered is the potential for sort of pulling off samples, taking them to an on-site evaluation opportunity at a future reactor, and then getting not real time, but ideally on the scale of, I'd say, an hour to a couple hours base of information that can help a reactor operators dictate the path forward on a more reasonable basis.
Thank you. Can the process be automated, you think?
Um, yes, we would anticipate, or at least minimizing sort of the need for glove boxes is what I would say our goal was and what the goal should be generally.
So I'm still monitoring to see if we collect any other questions in the chat, and I don't think I see any hands raised, but I do have a bit of a kind of experience-based question. So y'all have looked at a number of different systems, kind of at a variety of different maturity levels, and so I guess based on the different data points that you have for your experience, would I guess the kind of higher level question here is how has the concept of defense in depth fit into the kind of the methodology or the framework of the safety case? I guess one of the things that I have heard, and I think we've kind of touched on it in a few of the other community of practices, is the kind of developing an objective or reproducible performance based framework for defense in depth has been, kind of an aspiration and a desire, and there's been a few attempts, but I don't know that many people would say that it's been implemented successfully. I guess maybe could you speak to any of the insights that y'all have gotten as you've gone through this? Any things in particular that are common across different technologies, or different, and would depend on the specific design or even the specific tool or design maturity at which you're evaluating.
You're really putting me on the spot with that one. So thank you for the interesting thought experiment there. I'm not going to sit here and say that I have a great answer for you. This sounds like something that's actively being considered. And with the other caveat that I was focused on the risk-informed aspects of things, not necessarily the performance-based in here. I guess what I'll say is that defense in depth is really sort of a holistic thing to consider and not necessarily something you can evaluate at a subsystem or component level in great detail. With that being said, maybe something like Nancy Levison's stamp-based framework, which really considers safety to be emergent, would help you get at the holistic evolutions a bit better. With that being said, I can kind of interpret in my mind how, as we move through addressing action items and things like that, maybe some of that could be an inkling into moving in the defense in depth direction, but I don't want to go further than that.
Well, I'll go ahead and go further than that. So we have observed in PHA evolutions on molten salt reactor and molten salt cooled reactors. Very frequently, the same safety related function is called out on a large number of evaluated events. So that is at least a qualitative indicator that that system might require a higher level of either quality or might require redundancy or diversity to ensure that it continued to function. For example, or we actually, when we did a HAZOP for a reactor design team, identified instrumentation that they installed during startup of the facility in question, but determined that it was only necessary to identify whether or not they had adequately filled the system, and were in the process of removing it when we did the HAZOP, and that function was identified as part of the HAZOP as being important to safety, and they ended up making a design change and leaving it in the system. So there are insights that are available in later stage PHAs that can help you think through the need for defense in depth. They don't quantitatively identify when an adequate level of defense in depth has been achieved, though.
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, Megan, sorry, I wasn't trying to put you on the spot. I mean, if there was an answer to it, then that would be, that's what the community of practice is for, right? But I do like the idea of I think kind of the synthesis of those two answers being, you can get insights towards it, but the I think the challenge there is, since defense in depth is holistic and you don't know what you don't know necessarily, especially early on in the process, um, you know, the trickiest part is characterizing how much you do know versus how much you don't know.
Amen.
I am not seeing anything else in the chat right now.
Well, then we will give people 7 minutes back to their day, or those of us who are on the East Coast can consider starting our weekend a little earlier than we might have otherwise planned. Thank you all for attending this, and we would welcome your continued comments.